If you want to understand why so many intelligent, capable people in their 50s and 60s wake up every morning and spend half their day fighting through a haze of mental cloudiness, struggling to retrieve words they know, losing their train of thought mid-sentence, feeling like they are operating at a fraction of their mental capacity, don't look at their stress levels. Don't look at their sleep duration. Look at what is happening inside the blood-brain barrier and the specific compounds that have now been scientifically documented to clear the inflammatory blockade that creates brain fog at its source. Hi, I'm Dr. Liana. I'm an emergency medicine physician and neuroinflammation researcher. I want to tell you something about brain fog that you almost certainly have never heard from anyone in a clinical setting, because most doctors have never looked at it through this particular lens. Brain fog is not a vague symptom without a biological substrate. It is a measurable neurological state driven by specific inflammatory mediators crossing a compromised blood-brain barrier, impairing the glial cell function that maintains optimal neural communication, and creating the functional impairment that people experience as cloudiness, slow retrieval, and cognitive drag. And one of the most potent and most overlooked compounds for reversing that process can be added to the tea most people are already drinking every single morning. Here is a number that should stop you cold. Researchers now estimate that chronic neuroinflammation, persistent low-grade inflammation within the central nervous system, is measurably present in over 60% of adults over the age of 55. Most of these people have never received that diagnosis. Most of them do not know that neuroinflammation is driving their cognitive complaints. And most of them are daily consuming beverages that, with one specific addition, could be actively reducing that neuroinflammation while they drink, rather than leaving the inflammatory process completely unaddressed as their cognitive function continues its slow deterioration. Most people have been told that brain fog is an inevitable byproduct of aging, poor sleep, or stress, a diffuse problem without a specific solution beyond improving those general factors. Most people have been told that their mental clarity issues are not serious enough to warrant investigation and that they should simply manage their caffeine intake and get more rest. Most people, in other words, have been given advice that addresses the symptom while leaving the underlying neurobiological process running completely unchecked. But after nearly 15 years practicing emergency medicine, where I have watched the consequences of unchecked neuroinflammation in its most acute and severe forms, and after spending significant time in the research literature on neuroinflammation's chronic low-grade manifestations, I have come to understand something that changes the entire picture. Chronic neuroinflammation is not primarily caused by aging. It is caused by a combination of gut microbiome dysbiosis, producing inflammatory compounds that cross a leaky blood-brain barrier, combined with deficits in the dietary compounds that the brain's immune cells, called microglia, need to shift from inflammatory activation mode to neuroprotective mode. The good news is that this is a modifiable process. The even better news is that the modification can begin with what you drink tomorrow morning. Think of your brain as a highly specialized factory that requires an extraordinarily controlled internal environment to operate properly. Every process that happens inside this factory, memory formation, attention maintenance, language retrieval, executive function, depends on precise electrochemical gradients, neurotransmitter concentrations, and glial cell function. The blood-brain barrier is the security system that regulates what enters the factory and what gets kept out, particularly inflammatory compounds from systemic circulation. When the blood-brain barrier is compromised, and it becomes progressively more porous in the context of gut dysbiosis, chronic systemic inflammation, and specific nutrient deficiencies, inflammatory cytokines and bacterial endotoxins from the gut begin crossing into brain tissue. When they arrive, they activate microglial cells, the brain's resident immune cells, into a hyperinflammatory state called M1 activation. And M1-activated microglia are not functioning as neuroprotectors. They are releasing inflammatory compounds inside brain tissue, disrupting the synaptic signaling that enables clear thinking and systematically degrading the functional environment of the neural circuits responsible for memory and focus. That is brain fog at its biological source, the compound that researchers have now documented can shift microglia from M1 inflammatory activation to M2 neuroprotective activation, while simultaneously reinforcing blood-brain barrier integrity and reducing the gut-sourced inflammation feeding the entire process, is a polyphenol called epigallocatechin galate, or EGCG, in specific concentration. And the most bioavailable food source of EGCG at those concentrations, when properly prepared and augmented with one specific addition, is matcha green tea. Japan's cognitive health statistics are extraordinary by any measure. The country consistently shows among the lowest rates of dementia and age-related cognitive decline in the developed world, despite a rapidly aging population. Researchers studying Japanese dietary patterns have returned repeatedly to the central role of matcha and high-concentration green tea consumption as a distinguishing variable. The average elderly Japanese adult in cognitive health research cohorts consumes 3 to 5 cups of high-grade green tea daily, providing EGCG concentrations that are now being directly linked to the microglial state changes documented in laboratory and clinical research. Here is exactly what happens mechanistically when properly concentrated EGCG reaches your brain. The first mechanism is microglial polarization from M1 to M2 state. In M1 activation, microglia produce a cascade of neurotoxic inflammatory compounds, including tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin-6, and nitric oxide at concentrations that impair synaptic transmission. When synaptic transmission is impaired, the signal clarity between neurons degrades. And that degraded clarity is what you experience as cognitive fog, slow retrieval, and the frustrating sense that your brain is not responding with its usual sharpness. EGCG, at concentrations achievable through 3 daily cups of properly brewed matcha, inhibits the NF-kappa B activation pathway that drives and maintains M1 microglial polarization. Think of NF-kappa B and microglia as the alarm system that keeps them in combat mode even when the initial threat has passed. EGCG essentially resets the alarm, allowing microglia to transition to M2 mode, where they shift from releasing neurotoxins to releasing neurotrophic factors, including BDNF and nerve growth factor, that actively support the neural communication clarity that clear thinking requires. Researchers at Harvard Medical School recruited 108 adults between the ages of 58 and 74 with documented cognitive complaints over a period of 14 weeks. Participants receiving concentrated EGCG supplementation, equivalent to the amount delivered by 3 daily servings of high-grade matcha, showed a 43% reduction in serum inflammatory markers associated with neuroinflammation, alongside statistically significant improvements in standardized cognitive assessment scores, measuring working memory, verbal fluency, and processing speed. The researchers used cerebrospinal fluid biomarkers to confirm that the systemic inflammatory reduction was associated with parallel changes in central nervous system inflammatory markers. The second mechanism is blood-brain barrier reinforcement through tight junction protein upregulation. EGCG has been shown to directly upregulate the production of claudin and occludin, the structural proteins that form the tight junctions maintaining blood-brain barrier impermeability. When these tight junction proteins are expressed at inadequate levels, as they are when gut inflammation produces the signals that downregulate their production, the blood-brain barrier becomes increasingly leaky, allowing the gut-sourced inflammatory compounds that drive microglial M1 activation to cross into brain tissue continuously. EGCG's tight junction upregulation effect essentially repairs the security system, progressively reducing the rate at which inflammatory compounds from systemic circulation reach brain tissue. This is a gradual but cumulative process. Meaningful barrier reinforcement requires 4 to 8 weeks of consistent EGCG consumption at sufficient concentrations, which is why a single cup of green tea occasionally produces modest effects, while consistent daily matcha consumption over weeks produces the cognitive clarity shift that clinical studies document. A landmark study from the University of Tokyo followed 133 adults with early cognitive impairment over a 24-week period, measuring blood-brain barrier permeability using validated biomarker proxies, including S100B protein levels, alongside neuroinflammation markers and cognitive function assessments. The high-grade green tea intervention group showed a 27% reduction in S100B levels, indicating improved blood-brain barrier integrity by week 12, with corresponding improvements in cognitive assessment scores that were statistically significant compared to controls. The researchers identified tight junction protein upregulation as the primary structural mechanism. The third mechanism is acetylcholinesterase inhibition. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter most directly associated with the cognitive functions people describe when they talk about mental sharpness, attention, memory encoding, language retrieval, and focused thinking. Acetylcholinesterase is the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine, regulating how long each acetylcholine signal remains active in synaptic junctions. In age-related cognitive decline, acetylcholinesterase activity often becomes upregulated, meaning acetylcholine signals are cleared too rapidly, reducing signal duration and weakening the neural communication that clear thinking depends on. EGCG has documented acetylcholinesterase inhibitory activity, exactly the mechanism targeted by the most widely prescribed pharmaceutical treatments for Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline. The difference is that EGCG produces this effect without the side effect profile of pharmaceutical acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, and it does so alongside the anti-neuroinflammatory mechanisms already described rather than through acetylcholine signaling alone. Penn State University researchers examining EGCG's cognitive effects in a study of 82 adults over 60 with mild cognitive impairment found that 12 weeks of daily high-concentration EGCG consumption produced a 31% improvement in a validated measure of attention and working memory capacity, with acetylcholinesterase activity markers confirming the inhibitory mechanism as a contributing factor alongside the inflammatory pathway changes. The addition that makes standard green tea dramatically more effective. And the one specific thing to add to your tea for the cognitive outcomes the research documents is L-theanine combined with black pepper extract. Here is why this combination transforms the protocol from good to exceptional. EGCG's bioavailability from standard green tea preparation is significantly limited by rapid oxidation and incomplete absorption in the gut environment. Black pepper extract containing piperine at a concentration of 5 mg per cup inhibits the CYP3A4 enzyme pathway responsible for degrading EGCG before it reaches systemic circulation, increasing EGCG bioavailability by documented estimates of 30 to 40% based on pharmacokinetic research. This single addition means that 3 cups of properly augmented matcha deliver the EGCG equivalent of 4 to 5 cups without augmentation. L-theanine, naturally present in green tea but at higher concentrations in matcha, works synergistically with EGCG through a complementary mechanism. L-theanine increases alpha-wave brain activity, the neural oscillation pattern associated with calm, focused attention rather than anxious arousal, while simultaneously enhancing GABA production that facilitates the parasympathetic nervous system state most conducive to clear cognitive function. The combination of EGCG reducing neuroinflammatory impairment and L-theanine optimizing the brain's electrical oscillation state produces a synergistic clarity effect that neither compound achieves independently. Here is the exact protocol based on what the clinical evidence supports. Prepare matcha using ceremonial or high-grade culinary matcha, 1 to 1.5 teaspoons whisked into water heated to 70 to 80 degrees Celsius, not boiling, as temperatures above 80 degrees degrade EGCG concentration significantly. This is consumed 3 times daily, morning, midday, and mid-afternoon, never within 4 hours of sleep, as the combined caffeine and L-theanine content will compromise sleep onset. To each cup, add 1/4 teaspoon of freshly ground black pepper or a black pepper extract capsule opened into the liquid. The piperine content at this dose provides the CYP3A4 inhibition needed for maximal EGCG bioavailability without the gastrointestinal irritation of higher doses. If matcha is not tolerable or available, high-grade loose-leaf Japanese green tea brewed for 3 minutes at similar temperature provides approximately 60 to 70% of the EGCG concentration of equivalent matcha preparation, a meaningful dose that still delivers documented cognitive benefits with consistent daily consumption. From clinical practice, here are 4 things that transform good results into dramatic cognitive clarity improvement. First, combine the matcha protocol with the elimination of refined sugar from the morning diet. Fructose consumption has specific and well-documented effects on hippocampal BDNF suppression that directly counteract the neurotropic benefits of EGCG. Second, add 500 milligrams of phosphatidylserine daily, a phospholipid that serves as a structural component of neuronal membranes and directly supports the cognitive function improvements EGCG initiates by ensuring the membranes are optimally constructed to execute them. Third, ensure adequate magnesium intake. Magnesium glycinate at 300 milligrams nightly is ideal, as magnesium deficiency directly impairs NMDA receptor function in hippocampal circuits and creates cognitive impairment that compounds neuroinflammation effects. Fourth, spend 20 minutes in morning sunlight within 1 hour of waking. This entrains the circadian rhythm that governs cortisol timing and creates the hormonal environment most supportive of cognitive clarity throughout the day. The mistakes that consistently undermine this protocol, using low-grade culinary matcha with inconsistent EGCG content, produces unpredictable results. Quality matters more than quantity in this intervention. Adding dairy milk to matcha directly, as opposed to plant-based alternatives, creates casein EGCG binding that dramatically reduces EGCG bioavailability and largely cancels the protocol's primary mechanism. Expecting overnight transformation, the blood-brain barrier reinforcement and microglial polarization shift that produce deep and sustained cognitive clarity typically requires 4 to 6 weeks of consistent daily practice. Let me bring everything together clearly. Brain fog is not vague, age-related cognitive noise. It is measurable neuroinflammation driving microglial M1 activation that impairs the signal clarity of the neural circuits responsible for your memory, focus, and mental sharpness. EGCG from high-grade matcha addresses this at 3 simultaneous biological levels, shifting microglia from inflammatory to neuroprotective mode, reinforcing blood-brain barrier integrity to reduce the inflammatory input feeding the problem, and inhibiting the acetylcholinesterase activity that is degrading acetylcholine signal duration in your cognitive circuits. The addition of piperine from black pepper extract elevates EGCG bioavailability by 30 to 40%, ensuring the protocol delivers the tissue concentrations documented in clinical research. Starting tomorrow morning, your first cup of augmented matcha begins shifting the neuroinflammatory environment that has been creating the cognitive fog you have been managing. Your microglia are not permanently stuck in inflammatory activation mode. The blood-brain barrier has the cellular machinery to tighten and heal. The neurotransmitter systems responsible for your mental sharpness are intact and waiting for the conditions to function optimally. You can begin creating those conditions tomorrow morning. Dr. Liana out. I want to address one more dimension of the brain fog picture that this protocol addresses, which is the relationship between blood glucose dysregulation and acute cognitive impairment that is separate from and in addition to the chronic neuroinflammation pathway I have described in detail. Many people experiencing persistent brain fog are also experiencing what researchers call postprandial cognitive impairment, a measurable and reproducible reduction in cognitive performance in the 1 to 2 hours following meals, particularly carbohydrate-containing meals. This phenomenon is driven by the same insulin resistance and glucose metabolism dysregulation that drives metabolic syndrome, and its effects on cognitive clarity are immediate and acute rather than the gradual chronic impairment that neuroinflammation produces. EGCG has documented effects on postprandial glucose management through inhibition of intestinal alpha-glucosidase, the enzyme responsible for breaking down complex carbohydrates into absorbable simple sugars, which slows the rate of glucose absorption after carbohydrate-containing meals and moderates the insulin and blood glucose spike that produces postprandial cognitive impairment. This is a separate mechanism from the neuroinflammatory pathways already described, and it adds an acute benefit on top of the chronic neuroinflammatory benefits, meaning that 3 cups of matcha daily provides both immediate improvement in postprandial cognitive clarity and progressive chronic improvement in neuroinflammatory burden and blood-brain barrier integrity over the weeks and months of consistent use.